of Montana at Missoula. Here in Montana, an environmental crisis has led to a crimes trial underway that the government has called the nation's biggest environmental disaster. Government prosecutors called their final witness on Monday in their case against W.R. Grace & Company. The firm and 5 former executives are charged with knowingly exposing their workers and the public to vermiculite, which contaminated with asbestos from the company's mine in Libby, Montana. Hundreds of miners, their family members, and townsfolk have died. At least 1,200 have been sickened from exposure to the toxic asbestos. W.R. Grace knew from the time it bought the mine in 1963 why the people in Libby were dying. But for the 30 years it owned the mine, the company did not stop it. Tens of thousands of internal company documents and court papers show years of extensive communication among the company's top officials about concealing the danger of asbestos in the ore and the consumer products that were made from it. They discuss methods to keep federal investigators from studying the health of the miners and efforts to mask the hazard of working with the contaminated ore. The mine was closed in 1990, but federal officials did not begin examining the hazards in Libby until 1999, when the Seattle Post-Intelligencer published a series of articles that broke the story. In the first article, journalist Andrew Schneider wrote, quote, "It takes anywhere from 10 to 40 years from the time a person is exposed to dangerous amounts of asbestos for the disease to reveal themselves. So in Libby, the killing goes on." Gayla Benefield has been an activist and advocate for victims of asbestos exposure for many years. She was one of the first residents in Libby to begin to raise awareness about the issue and help the story gain national attention. Both her parents died from exposure to asbestos. She and her husband both have asbestosis. 30 members of her extended family have been affected. She joins us now on the telephone from Libby. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Can you lay out for the listeners and viewers of Democracy Now! Just what the history of your town of Libby is, how this all happened?
Well, the vermiculite, as the product is called, it's an insulating product, was discovered in the early 1900s in Libby. And actually it was marketed, produced, everything else right here from Libby under the trade name Zonalite. And the mine in 1962 was purchased by W.R. Grace, and it was one of the 2 industries that we had in Libby, the other industry being logging, and which comprised the majority of the workforce. This was a small mine that possibly employed 400 people at the maximum. But the mine continued to mine the ore and to ship the ore. 80% of the world's vermiculite came from Libby, Montana. And my father went to work there in 1954. But by 1968, he was becoming very ill, short of breath. He was diagnosed with heart disease, arthritis, just like a lot of his coworkers were. But by 1971, he was finally diagnosed with asbestosis of the lungs and given 18 months to live. At that time, he was 61 years old. And he died in 1974 from asbestosis. And the company didn't really seem to be concerned about it. The men who worked there didn't seem to be concerned about it. But I was very angry because of his age. He was young, comparatively, at the time when he died. And so I started investigating and simply watching the friends of the fathers and the mothers of friends who had worked at the mine, because we were more or less a close-knit group. And over time, I would find that more and more of these men had become ill and were on oxygen. And the explanation being, well, you smoked at one time. I mean, the diagnosis was never given in Libby to a miner. And by 1985, it became very apparent that what was going on up at the mountain. And I constantly went from our governor all the way back down to our city council, back up to the governor, saying, you know, the men that are working up there are dying. It was very obvious to me. And at that point, I was a meter reader for the power company, so I was literally in everyone's backyards. In these backyards, I would find these men sitting on their porches, with oxygen tanks. And they were men who had worked with my father, and it was a matter of connecting the dots. But I was terribly alarmed. And in 1985, my mother, after being hospitalized yearly for pneumonia for the last 7 years, was finally diagnosed with asbestosis, classic asbestosis, and it was caused by secondary exposure, which was totally unheard of. And I think from that point on, I really became vigilant. I became very outspoken towards the company. And also at that point, there was a decision in the state Supreme Court called the Gidley-Priest decision that allowed people to go back and sue W.R. Grace for the loss of a loved one, or the men could go back and actually sue for benefits. Because of the workman's comp rules and the latency period of the disease, if they weren't diagnosed within 3 years of working at the mine, they simply weren't eligible for workman's comp. But in 1990, the mine shut down, and they claimed lack of, I'm not sure exactly what, they had all sorts of reasons why they shut down, but they did shut the mine down in 1990. And by then my mother had passed away. I had filed suit against W.R. Grace in court, and I, along with 4 other cases that went to jury, received guilty verdicts for the death of my mother or for the sickness of a certain person. And in 1999, I noticed a small article in the newspaper saying that they were going to give back the final amount of a reclamation bond, and the final amount was only $67,000. The full reclamation bond on the mine that was set in 1972 was a little over $500,000, which was ridiculous. But I protested that $67,000 returned, and I asked for an investigation of the mine site, because to me it did not seem reclaimed. Nothing was growing up there. I was still very cautious about W.R. Grace because people were still being sickened and dying, and at that point there was over 300 people in Libby who were diagnosed with the disease, and many of which had never worked at the mine, didn't have anything to do with the mine. They simply had lived, worked, or played in Libby. And once I filed the complaint with the DEQ, Andy Schneider heard about it and came on the scene. And Andy, being a professional investigator, newspaper reporter, investigative reporter, immediately picked up on this and asked if I had anything to substantiate my stories. And by then I had probably 10,000 court documents that I had gotten as a result of all of the cases in Libby. And those documents were totally damning. The confidential memos from W.R. Grace, between their employees, between the people actually on trial, and a lot of others. And so probably the rest is history. The story came out in the national newspapers because our local papers simply refused to even cover the court cases in Libby. I mean, these were monumental trials that we were holding against a Fortune 500 company and winning. And we could not get a reporter in the state to cover these trials at all.
We're talking to Gayla Benefield. She is speaking to us from Libby. She and her husband both suffer from asbestosis. 30 members of her extended family have died as a result. We're going to go to break, and then we'll be back with her, as well as 2 reporters who've been covering this issue now for quite a time. We're reporting from Missoula, Montana, where this historic trial is taking place. Stay with us.